New York Times, Sienna, Trump is up +6. That's the most recent one. Corrupt secretaries of states who are acting as the referees in all of these different states who are going to be rigging this through and through.
She co-sponsored and fully sponsored this radical Green New Deal, which would cost the American people almost $100 trillion. And it would make electricity prices higher and would make our inflation problems worse.
I would imagine increase the attacks on Kamala, and her record is terrible. Trump's polls are surging in the aftermath of Joe Biden's incompetency. Bad debate, bad interview. He's promising to stay in the race, but Trump seemingly is nonplussed, just hanging out Mar-a-Lago, chit-chatting with some other people. This is what the scene looked like down there when he was hanging out in Florida, saying what's up to everybody, walking on out because things are looking good. A lot of people saying, where's Trump? Why isn't he saying a bunch of stuff? And the people in the media want him to come out and change the story very quickly. They'd like it if he came out and did something very flashy and big and vibrant so that they could stop talking about Joe Biden's problematic brain. But here are what some of the polls look like over from Real Clear Politics. You see here, Trump plus everything, looking good. New York Times, Sienna, Trump is up +6. That's the most recent one. Up another +6 from the Wall Street Journal. Up +2 from the CBS News poll. There was one that came out not too long ago where it's a tie from Reuters and Ipsos. Yahoo News up is +2, +4 from Harvard Harris. And this is looking pretty good. And as we talked about, you see this massive spread that has happened here in the aftermath of the debate. Trump was very much up ahead. Then the debate happened and boom, we have Trump is up and to the right, Joe Biden is down and to the right. And so big spread. Now you see a little bit of a trending up for Joe, right? Some of this might bounce back. And I think what the Biden campaign is going to do is try to treat this just like a bad political cycle, just like we always have bad political cycles. Stuff comes, stuff goes, but people forget about it, right? Look at all these other bad political cycles, right? Oh, Trump's way up here. He's way up here, but it always closes back down. So you have the political analysts who just say, just wait it out. It'll close back up. All right. All the hysterical Democrats will get less hysterical. They're just hysterical people in general. So they get worked up about everything. Like, oh, masks are off, and oh, climate change, and oh, bigotry, all this. Okay. So they'll relax. So they know that about their own people. So they'll come back. It's just a matter of time. But Trump is pulling away. And the question is, can it be too big to rig? I am not ever going to write this election off. We have the CIA, the FBI, billions of dollars from the big tech companies. We've got corrupt secretaries of states who are acting as the referees in all of these different states who are going to be rigging this through and through. So it needs to be way too big to rig. The question is, can we get there? Here is what CNN reports on the polls.
I just want to point out where the polls are now, where they were at this point back in 2020, and Joe Biden's worst position in the polls back in 2020. Right now, Donald Trump leads in an aggregate of national polls by about 3 percentage points. If you go back 4 years ago at this point, Joe Biden was ahead by 9 points. This right now don't look anything like what we saw 4 years ago at this point.
No.
I then decided to take it a step further. What was Biden's worst 2020 polling position? He was ahead by 4 points, which basically matched what he ended up beating Donald Trump by in the national popular vote. So this 3-point advantage for Donald Trump is Donald Trump's best position versus Joe Biden, whether you include the polls this year or you include the polls last cycle. The idea that the polls underestimated Joe Biden last time around, simply put, does not hold any water, Mr. Berman.
Not in the general election, certainly. What about in terms of being underestimated in the Trump era in general?
Yeah, so I decided to expand upon our search. Who outperformed their July national polls? This is major elections during the Trump era. We can start in the midterms, right? Take a look here. This is a 2022 midterm. Wow. This is a generic congressional ballot. In fact, Republicans were underestimated by a point. They outperformed their July polls and the actual result by a percentage point. You go back to 2018, Democrats did outperform their polls, but just by a point. Basically, the polls were right on at this particular point in the midterm elections. We talk about the presidential race. Last time around, Donald Trump actually did better in the results than his July polls by 5 points. You go back to 2016, you see something very similar.
So if Trump's
that
up
is
plus
the July
5 like
polls
now,
actually underestimated Donald
10.
Trump. He outperformed his July polls. So the idea in the Trump
we're not
era
getting
that
complacent.
the polls have underestimated Democrats, whether it be in a Joe Biden matchup, whether it be a matchup against Hillary Clinton, whether it be in the midterms, at least in the national polling, that right now shows Donald Trump in his strongest position, simply put, is not true. If anything, the polls have underestimated Republicans during the Trump era, especially in the presidential races in 2016 and in 2020.
Well, on that front, I mean, how unusual is it for a Republican to be ahead by this much right now.
Yeah, so let's go all the way back. Who led in early July polls? Well, right now, Donald Trump is ahead. Go back in 2020, a Democrat, Biden. 2016, Hillary Clinton, a Democrat. 2008, 2012, a Democrat. Even in 2004, where George W. Bush ended up winning, John Kerry was actually ahead in the polls at this point. You have to go all the way back to 2000, to George W. Bush being ahead in the early July polls. You have to go all the way back to the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, to find a Republican ahead at this point. 24 years. At this particular point, the idea that a Democrat is ahead, there are voters in the electorate who are dealing with a poll position they have never seen before, and that is a Republican leading in the national popular vote, at least according to the polls.
A very unusual situation. One thing I just will point out,
Nice.
Biden may be talking about the primaries in 2020, where he did not do well in Iowa and New Hampshire, and then he ended up with the nomination. But that's a different animal. That is a vastly different animal than any kind of a general election setting.
Correct. In fact, if you were to look back at the 2020 national Democratic primary polls, they mostly had Biden ahead, except for that little small portion, right, when he lost Iowa and then lost to New Hampshire and then lost to Nevada. But overall, those primary polls had him ahead, and then he won. And certainly when it came to the general election, the polls always had Joe Biden ahead. There wasn't a single poll that met CNN standards for publication that ever had Donald Trump ahead in 2020. And now you have a slew of them, and the average, of course, definitely has Donald Trump ahead.
That's right, what he says.
All right, so what are they going to do about that? Are they going to be able to let that stand? Not sure that they can. So here is Byron Donalds. He says it doesn't really matter what happens, whether it's Kamala who gets slotted in there, whether Joe Biden makes his promise to stick to it to the end, whether that goes through or not, doesn't matter. Trump's record speaks for itself. Here was Byron Donalds explaining.
We think also if you start to really dig into some other polls that have come out, that Donald Trump does just as well against Kamala Harris, if not better, when you compare her to Joe Biden. The other thing is, we've not really gone into depths with the record of Kamala Harris. When she was a United States Senator, she co-sponsored and fully supported Bernie Sanders' radical takeover of American health care. Would add $32 trillion to a $35 trillion debt already. She co-sponsored and fully sponsored this radical Green New Deal, which would cost the American people almost $100 trillion, and it would make electricity prices higher and would make our inflation problems worse. And then you look at her job as vice president. She's the border czar, but did nothing. The last time she was at the border almost 2 years ago, there have been 6 million new illegal immigrants in our country. What did she do?
Nothing.
She's the AI czar. Nothing materialized. What did she do? And then you get to the interviews. I mean, whether you're talking about the cackling laugh or Venn diagrams, there's not been anything of substance.
Yes.
So if she's now at the top of the ticket, our game plan remains the same. It talks about the disastrous agenda from the Biden-Harris administration and how Donald Trump will make America great again.
Yeah, man, that was a nice stinger right there. That was a minute 15 from Byron Donalds. Woo, that was fired. And he's absolutely right. Kamala's terrible. And as the Biden administration continues to try to make this a bundled presidential campaign, it's a 2-for-1. It's a twofer. You get President Biden and you get Vice President Kamala. And that way, if Joe Biden keels over, you can just slot her in there. So they will, I would imagine, increase the attacks on Kamala, and her record is terrible. And now people are going to be looking at her a lot more seriously because she's a part of the bundled deal. But Byron Donalds just drops it, and it will be fun to see him out there going after both of them as this campaign heats up.